Baltimore, Maryland. The Kennedy Krieger Institute has various inpatient hospital units, clinics, programs, and schools to help children and adolescents with pediatric developmental disabilities. The neurobehavioral unit is an inpatient unit within the Kennedy Krieger Hospital for children with intellectual disabilities who have severe and many times life-threatening behavioral disorders such as self-injury, aggression, and property destruction. These kids are in jeopardy of losing their home or school placements because of their behavior, and they typically reside in the unit for 4 to 6 months. I'd like to give you a little background on how my position has evolved on the NPU, and essentially why Samantha Hardesty and I are presenting OBM-type data rather than clinical case studies. Dave introduced me as someone that recruits and oversees the direct care staff, but I haven't always done that. In fact, for most of my tenure with the NPU, I've been what we call a senior behavior analyst. That is, I'm a faculty member supervising master's level clinicians who provide assessment and treatment to our patients. Our goals are to reduce destructive behaviors to 80% or greater using a behavior analytic approach and to train caregivers and teachers to implement the behavior plans. As a senior behavior analyst, I was happy as a clam. I was getting to do some clinical research. I was directly supervising clinicians who were typically graduate students who were highly motivated, very bright, and a pleasure to work with. Back then, I remember thinking, wow, life is good. And then, I think I'm ahead of myself. Here we go. And then, many years ago, the director of the unit, who was Wayne Fisher at the time, asked me if I'd like to have a dual role on the unit. He proposed I could continue to supervise clinicians in their cases, and I could also become the director of direct care services, meaning I would oversee the management of, at that time, approximately 60 entry-level direct care staff. Our direct care staff provide patient care around the clock to patients when they aren't in the therapy sessions with their assigned clinicians. The direct care staff is also responsible for implementing behavioral treatments that are written by clinicians, taking data, feeding, and bathing patients. At the time, the NPU was a 12-bed unit, and we had the room and the clinicians to take on more patients, but we didn't have enough direct care staff. I thought this opportunity sounded pretty neat, and in my little corner of the world, it almost seemed as if the unit kind of ran itself. So how hard could this be? Not to mention there were 5 supervisors already in place that I would oversee who were responsible for scheduling the direct care staff and doing their performance evaluations. We also had someone from a temp agency who was acting as sort of a recruiter, as well as an administrative assistant. Although Wayne advised me to take some time and think about this, I was actually naive enough to believe that his proposal was a no-brainer. In fact, I thought this would be kind of fun, and maybe even a reason to ask for a small raise. I accepted the promotion and enjoyed getting credit, so to speak, for not only being a senior behavior analyst, but also the director of direct care staff. And I continued to do what I loved, which was the supervision of cases. And I remember thinking, wow, life is really good. And then, as you can all imagine, since you know better, folks started coming to me with problems that revolved around the direct care staff. And these were big problems, such as, we don't have enough staff to get through the next schedule. And staff are quitting because they're working too much overtime and they're being scheduled to work every weekend. And the dreaded morale is low. The nursing staff were complaining that the direct care staff didn't respect them. The clinicians were saying that the direct care staff weren't implementing protocols correctly. And all the while, the Kennedy Krieger administration was asking us to hire more direct care staff so that we could expand the unit. And I realized then that while I had a lot of clinical experience, what I really needed now was some business experience. And I remember thinking, wow, I am totally screwed. For a while, I kind of ran around trying to fix problems as they arose, and it took me some time to realize that what we needed was to use the same careful, objective measurement and assessment of managerial problems as we had been doing successfully for years for problem behavior with our patients. I began asking the supervisors and the recruiter and the administrative assistant to show me the data when they came to me with problems. And they were all such nice employees that they all tried to develop their own spreadsheets so that they could start collecting data on the problem du jour. But unfortunately, each of them were keeping information on their activities separately and trying to code data from forms and we've been using for years. And the information typically came to me in various, very bizarre formats. Information was missing, there was a lot of difficulty even getting the information together, and overall, it was a pretty inefficient process. What I had forgotten is these guys weren't behavior analysts, and they didn't have the time or the resources to do what I was asking them to do, and now they found themselves with the additional responsibility of a spreadsheet that made no sense to anyone. And I remember thinking at the time, well, I can't even say to you what I was thinking at the time. This is what a colleague of mine put on the wall of my office because it reminded her of the situation I was in, and I've saved it all these years. As you can see, I'm frantically trying to escape the jaws of the NBU. By now, Louis Hagopian is the director of the NBU. He's just a little piece of toast in the water, and he's not even savable. And I don't even think there's a pilot flying this helicopter. It was around this time that I went to Louis for help, and we discussed the idea of creating a whole subspecialty or culture that appreciated the importance of using behavior analysis to tackle staffing problems. And Louis gave me the okay to identify someone who could help me with the process. Fortunately, I kind of stumbled upon a fabulous opportunity when one of the clinicians I was working with, Bowman and Hardesty, who like myself is trained as a clinician, expressed an interest in using applied behavior analysis to improve our staffing problems. So I scooped up Sam immediately as the person to help me, and she started working on a way in which to bring all the crazy data we've been collecting in various places together to one location by creating an access database. This database provided a way to ensure that all information we needed was in one central location. It could be accessed by all of the supervisors and would have the capacity to grow with us and handle all the data that we have been collecting. Now, data such as recruitment, such as how many positions we have filled, data on our staff, such as attendance and performance, and data on our patients, such as their size and topography of destructive behavior, were all in one place. And the best thing about the database is that it's user-friendly. Sam created electronic forms that looked exactly like those old pieces of paper that the supervisors were using. So they were familiar, and all they needed to do was click a pointer to input their data. Fast forward to today, and although we have an awful lot of work to do, we've been able to improve our recruitment efforts. The unit has now over 120 direct care staff, and we were eventually able to expand the unit to a 16-bed unit. We've improved our training of direct care staff, and we've been able to work on several performance improvement projects. And to top it off, Sam began taking classes under Siggy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So now we have an expert in the field of OPM to collaborate with as we continue to tackle some of these issues that are keeping me up at night. So life is good again, but this time I take nothing for granted. I'd like to show you some data from projects that were generated after observing trends in the database. Our most pressing problem, again, was that we needed to attract qualified individuals for the open direct care positions. We found that 84% of our recruitment costs were going towards newspaper ads. And unfortunately, we also found that close to 80% of newspaper applicants didn't even make it through the hiring process. So we weren't getting a lot of bang for our buck. We did notice that we had some college students that were making it through the hiring process and were staying with us a little bit longer than our typical staff. Based on these data, we dropped the newspaper ads and began focusing our efforts on local colleges and universities. We stopped using the temp agency for recruitment. We modified the recruiting position to include going out to college job fairs, and we promoted one of our direct care staff to be our recruiter. Since college students typically can't work 40 hours a week because they're taking classes, we created part-time positions and required a portion of the hours worked to occur on weekends. This seemed to help our staff morale problem a bit because it gave the full-time folks an opportunity to take some weekends off. This reallocation of time and money resulted in many things. We were able to hire more individuals each year. This graph starts in 2002. This is the number of requisitions we had each year. And even though we were hiring more people, our recruitment costs decreased significantly. Recruitment costs averaged between $58,000 to $70,000 per year when we advertised predominantly in newspapers. It decreased to about $9,000 per year by fiscal year 2009. Our talk is entitled Lessons Learned, and what I learned from our recruitment problems was that my original gut feeling of show me the data was right. We didn't know how or where to recruit direct care staff. We weren't recruiters, but our data led us in the right direction, dumping the newspaper ads and focusing on colleges, doubled our staffing, and decreased recruitment costs by about 85%. Once staffing levels were stable, we began poking into some problems that we were identifying through the database. One problem we noticed was that staff were sometimes not wearing their ID badges to work. Every employee in the Institute is given an ID badge that hangs on a lanyard that you're supposed to wear around your neck. When employees don't bring their badges to work, they're breaking the security policy of the Institute. But where it affects the NBU the most, and how we were able to detect it, was that they can't swipe in or out of our time clock payroll system without a badge. To avoid an incorrect paycheck, employees who don't bring their badge to work must fill out a time clock adjustment form, or what we call a TCAP. Basically, the employee fills out the form. The form has to be signed by a supervisor who's to verify the time that the employee worked. The form goes to the finance department, and someone has to manually input the times into our time clock system. Not only is there a greater chance of human error, but it takes multiple people a decent amount of time to fix a problem that can be avoided by just bringing your badge to work. Our goal was to increase ID badge wearing and therefore decrease the number of TCAPs that staff completed. This is a graph of the number of TCAP forms filled out each week by staff with a range of 0 to 20. The phases indicate several interventions that were not effective, such as an in-service, prompting staff with memos, and even group-based public postings per shift, with verbal recognition from supervisors to the winning shift. When none of that worked, we established criteria for staff to reach as a group. The first phase, where you see a red criterion line, represents a condition wherein if the group submitted 6 TCAPs or less during the week, they were able to view patient assignment prior to their shift. That is, they could see in advance which patient they were assigned to, and they could request to switch who they were working with as long as they coordinated it with a co-worker who was working that same shift. This is something that they had picked as a reward, and when the TCAPs did in fact decrease to under 6 per week, our thought was to do a change in criterion design. At around week 56, we changed our criterion to 4 TCAPs or less per week. However, staff was not able to meet the new criterion until we added a response cost. The final phase that has a red criterion line is where we added the response cost, and that if the group had 4 TCAPs or more for the week, the staff lost the privilege to choose the patient that they wish to work with for the following week. Rather, it would be done by random assignment. That is, if you don't have your badge, the computer picks who you work with, and the group cannot make a change. Basically, for our staff, an in-service, memos, graphic feedback, public postings, plus verbal praise were not successful in increasing badge wearing, but the response cost of not being allowed to pick the patient assignment was helpful in reducing the amount of TCAP. Regarding some performance improvement projects we've worked on, here's a project that focused on staff training. Training the direct care staff is an enormous endeavor, and we cram in an awful lot of information into their own daily orientation. We replicated some of the work you all have done using response cards in educational settings in our human service setting. The response card costs about $2, and it's simply a small whiteboard where participants write down answers and hold them up rather than raise their hand in response to a question. In this study, newly hired staff was taught a class in basic behavioral principles using the 2 different formats, response cards versus the more traditional hand raising. A total of 101 newly hired direct care staff participated, 51 in the response card group and 50 in the standard or hand raising group over a 9-month period. Our results suggest that the response card groups performed better than the hand raising groups on post-test that was administered about 2 weeks following the training class. This is a graph of the average percent of correct responses for both groups. The response card group averaged 87% correct responses, so it's kind of like getting a B+ on the test. And the hand raisers averaged only 72% correct responses, which is similar to a low C. What did we learn from the TCAP and response card projects? Well, we learned something that everyone concerned about our budget wanted to hear, that it's possible that a zero or low-cost intervention can be effective. In a second study involving staff training, we increased communication between our clinicians and our direct care staff. Each day, the clinicians, as part of their jobs, are supposed to approach the direct care staff assigned to their patient and review what we call a protocol review, which is kind of a mini quiz of 10 questions about their patient. This is a way to ensure that patient-specific training is continually occurring from clinician to direct care staff, and it gives the direct care staff an opportunity to ask questions and get feedback on their patient's protocols. Direct care staff began mentioning to us that they weren't always getting this training, so we decided to take some data. Our baseline data showed that the direct care staff was accurate in their concerns, and that only 21% of the protocol reviews were being reviewed with them each week. We learned a lesson here right off the bat. Our clinicians weren't doing what we told them to do. Naughty clinician. The first baseline indicates where we did an in-service with all of the clinicians, and we reminded them of the rationale for doing the reviews for the direct care staff. Given that we saw no change in behavior following the in-service, we modified the reviews based on the clinician's suggestions and even reduced the review to only 5 key questions rather than 10. With still no change in behavior, we brought out the big guns, and we had the director of the unit, aka Lewis, deliver electronic feedback to the group. He reminded them of the rules and established consequences for non-completion of the reviews. Now, failure to meet criteria resulted in individual feedback from him, from the director, and progressive disciplinary action to the clinician, for example, a verbal warning. With this avoidance contingency in place, 86% of protocol reviews were now being completed. Removal of feedback resulted in a drop in percent completion to 78%. Reinstatement of feedback alone was not helpful, but reinstatement of rules plus feedback resulted in an increase once again. And the final study I'd like to show you focused on hand washing. Healthcare workers are susceptible to transmitting contagious diseases but often fail to practice good hand washing hygiene, and less than 40% of clinicians adhere to CDC recommendations. We decided to target hand washing as a performance improvement project. At the time, several hand washing initiatives were in place for the hospital, including annual infection control and services. There were signage all around the hospital, and we have 10 wall-mounted hand sanitizers and 9 sinks located throughout the NBU for staff to use. We replicated Geller's model on critical antecedents, and we identified 5 critical antecedents to hand washing, such as entering and exiting the unit, going from one patient to another, after toileting a patient, and prior to feeding a patient. We then conducted a critical antecedent analysis to identify stimulus conditions under which hand washing was likely to occur. Now, I'm a bit of a germaphobe myself, and I suspected that staff hand washing could improve in maybe 1 or 2 situations. But I must tell you, I was pretty shocked to see that hand washing needed to improve across all situations, and that we were no better than the hand washing averages observed in prior studies. Hand washing was low across all critical antecedents for the direct care staff, averaging about 11% of over 200 observations. Our hypothesis was that staff had so many competing responsibilities. They were many times physically managing a very disruptive patient. They had clickers and they had clipboards, and that maybe perhaps we needed to reduce the response effort for hand washing. This is a graph that spans over 7 months and depicts the percentage of opportunities in which hand washing occurred. Our first intervention was an antecedent manipulation designed to decrease response effort and act as a prompt to staff to wash their hands. We gave staff a 2-ounce bottle of hand sanitizer that was attached to a lanyard that they could wear around their neck, right next to that ID badge that they may or may not be wearing. Hand sanitizer data depicted with the open squares and the antecedent manipulation phase, and as you can see, this intervention was not effective. At this point, we decided to use reinforcement in order to override other competing contingencies which were keeping staff from washing their hands. Now, one way to do this would have been to monitor individual behavior and provide reinforcement contingencies to each staff. However, we have so many staff that this would have been a tedious and costly task. So since lotteries have been demonstrated as a way in which to exert control over a large group of people and to ensure minimal monitoring of individual behavior, we decided to create our own lottery. We administered a preference assessment with staff, and the majority of them identified a gift card from Target. To refer you back to the graph, the lone data point prior to the first lottery phase is from an observation following just a memo that went out to staff that explained the lottery. So I guess they started practicing their hand-washing skills before the lottery was even in place. During the lottery phases, staff names were entered into the lottery each time they were observed washing their hands following a critical antecedent. At the end of every 2 observations, which averaged out to be about 1 or 2 times per week, one name was randomly chosen and that individual received the $25 gift card. The lottery schedule was eventually thinned to every 3 observations, which was about 1 time per week. This group-based lottery was effective in increasing hand washing to 73.4%, and 22 gift cards were delivered over 7 months, totaling $550. So what lessons did we learn during the investigations I've reviewed? Well, obviously take data and let it lead you to an intervention. You don't always have to throw money at a problem. Don't always assume that people are doing things just because you told them to. Get staff input on what may work to fix a problem, but continue to take data. Sometimes staff suggestions functioned as reinforcers, and sometimes they did not. And finally, perhaps antecedents, such as the ones we use, such as memos, in-services, modifying the protocol reviews, and giving people hand sanitizers, are less powerful than consequences, such as the response cost of not being able to keep your patient, getting feedback from the director, or getting a gift card. Thank you for listening to my brief summary on how OPM has helped the NVU. Initially, I struggled showing you some of these data because I feel like I'm airing our dirty laundry and our dirty hands, and I'm afraid you may be thinking we have a lot of staff who just don't listen and ignore rules. Well, you have to trust me that we do have a good group of hardworking employees on the unit, but our feeling is if we don't admit to our shortcomings, how can we expect change? I'm happy to turn over the podium now to Bowman Hardesty, who will describe a huge project that she's spearheading regarding staff safety and environments such as our hospital setting. Thank you.
Well, I want to first say that we struggled to really get our talks for 20 minutes each. We have so much information we wanted to show you today. So I might go a little bit into lunch. I apologize if you need to leave. Feel free to go ahead and step out, and I apologize if I do go into it. I just want to say good morning. I am Samantha, and as Lynn mentioned, I'm originally trained as a clinician. I was one of those folks who started on the NVU. I wanted to work with children with autism, doing the assessment and treatment of problem behavior. But my general love of applied behavior analysis and working in this setting got me to get really excited about using those same principles to improve our staff training and our staff performance on the NVU, and that led me to OPM. And beginning in 2009, I started at UMBC in the doctoral program under Siggy Sigurdsson, and so I've been able to learn a great deal and been able to apply a lot of that to what I'm doing currently on the unit. And about 5 years ago, the reason I'm here presenting with Lynn is because this opportunity came across. It was really a lot about luck, it was all about timing, and I was really fortunate to be there and have the excitement and the energy to take on some of these projects and get them in motion. And I'm very happy today to be talking about one of our most extensive projects that we're doing, trying to reduce injuries in the workplace. So as many of you are aware, if you're working in these settings, that injuries in the workplace are a major problem worthy of being considered, and particularly for those individuals who are working in healthcare settings. And that encompasses about 10% of the entire working force. The Bureau of Labor Statistics indicated that nearly 50% of all non-fatal injuries from occupational assaults were occurring in the healthcare sector. It's quite a bit. And when you look at the incidence rates for injuries, 9.3 injuries are occurring per 100 full-time workers, if you look at healthcare in general. But as you start to look at specific professions within the healthcare sector, you see social service providers have an incidence rate as high as 15, and then if you're providing direct care or nursing to patients, it goes as high as 25. I became really curious looking at these incidence rates and thought to look at some other professions that we think are probably pretty dangerous, and I was really surprised to see how much higher the healthcare sector is than those. So I picked a few just to kind of give you an idea. So mining, 2.4 incidence rate, manufacturing and construction, 4.3, even police officers who are working with violent individuals probably on a pretty regular basis, their incidence rate is still lower than the healthcare sector. So workplace injuries are costly for many reasons. It's not just the physical effects that they're producing on our staff. There are several ripple effects which are going to affect the organization, the staff, as well as the very patients that we're serving. So for instance, if you're looking at the outcomes in staff, it's not just going to be that bruise, that cut, whatever happens, it's going to be the mental effects of that as well, because it's a very high-stress job. So for instance, individuals may experience anxiety, depression, or even substance abuse. And when looking at organizational outcomes, these individuals are going to be faced with more than just the medical bills that they're paying for the staff to get care. They're also going to be having issues with morale, and then of course morale is going to affect work productivity as well as absenteeism and turnover. And then if you're trying to recruit direct care staff, we know that that's very, very challenging because nobody wants to sign up for such a hazardous job. And the patient outcomes are also extremely important to consider, because without the appropriate treatment services in place for individuals that are exhibiting very intense, aggressive, and destructive behaviors, these individuals are going to be at a really great risk of more restrictive placements. So they're going to be taken out of their homes and placed in residential settings or locked units such as ours. Oftentimes, these individuals who are displaying these very dangerous behaviors may be over-medicated just to try to stabilize or sedate them so that they keep themselves safe and their families safe. And then also the use of restraint seclusion is more likely to occur if they're exhibiting these behaviors, and following the use of these methods, patients are going to be more likely to be hurt themselves. So many clinical settings are forced to approach safety in a very haphazard and organized fashion. Oftentimes, safety protocols are going to be developed and implemented based on isolated events that are very serious, that are worthy of concern, based on what we would hope to be industry best practices, but even that's not very clear, those are pretty vague, and on common sense. And unfortunately, doing this method to enhance safety doesn't take into account trends and patterns that may emerge if you're looking at data regularly and examining it. So the purpose of the study that I want to talk about today is how we're trying to accomplish that here on our unit. So what we're doing is a comprehensive safety assessment, which will help inform us in a direction of what our intervention will be to increase safe behaviors and reduce injuries on our unit. And the way we did this is that we followed the safety assessment guidelines suggested by McSween, and we conducted a retrospective analysis of all of the injury reports that were documented from our staff between the years 2008 and 2010. It's also important to note that as part of our comprehensive safety assessment, we also did a PDC as well as a safety climate survey with various staff. And the results were actually really helpful and beneficial. I think will inform our intervention greatly. However, that could be a whole separate talk. And so in the interest of time, I just want to go ahead and show you our injury analysis data, what our initial findings are, and the data that I'll be presenting to you today are going to serve as our baseline. So as part of our safety assessment, and any good safety assessment, it's extremely important to identify the pre-existing efforts in place, and then to build on those efforts. And given that the MPU has been providing services to this population for over 20 years, we figured out some really helpful ways to try to create a safer work environment. And much of what we're doing, you would think is best practice, and it's making a lot of good common sense. So just to give an idea of what we do currently on the unit to try to ensure safety. Our staff are offered a lot of training. Lynn already mentioned some of that. So immediately upon hire, they're going through a 2.5-week training process. And in this training process, we're doing some classroom information. We're teaching them about basic behavioral principles. We're teaching them about data collection. We're also doing a lot of hands-on. So they're demonstrating the skills that we expect them to do, and they're getting feedback on the spot. We've got senior direct care staff that are working with them and giving that feedback as they're working with the patients. A huge part of our training process is also the physical management training aspect, because it is such an intense population. And so our physical management training is something that we don't do in-house, and it's conducted by our senior clinicians. And it's very similar to package programs that are currently available in the market. What we also have, which is very fortunate, is the staff to be able to ensure that each patient has one staff member with them around the clock. And of course, if needed, we also have additional staff members as backup, or we can assign them so that there are 2 or 3 staff members perhaps working with one patient at a time. Also, we ensure that staff are following a strict dress code. This is all staff, including our direct care staff. And some of our requirements are just basic restrictions about what makes sense to minimize staff being hurt. So we would highly recommend they wear active shoes, something like a tennis shoe, so that you can catch up with that patient if they bolt. No high heels, obviously, no open-toed shoes, no dangly earrings that can be ripped out, and most of our staff are also very good about wearing their hair back. We also have a lot of protective equipment available to our staff, and these are at various locations throughout our unit. And just to give you an idea, I put some examples of what we typically use. And these are materials that we're having to borrow from other aspects and then modify for our purposes. So oftentimes we'll be using wrestling and hockey helmets. So those are soft padded in the back with a hard protective face shield in the front. We often use martial arts arm guards and chest protectors. We also have soccer shin guards available to our staff, and then Kevlar sleeves that welders often use to protect their arms. So all of our staff are highly encouraged, and as part of the training process, we explain why it's important to document injuries. And if they need to seek medical attention for any of the injuries that they do obtain while they're working on our unit, they have to complete one of these forms. And what they do is the form needs to be completed within 48 hours of the incident. And in order to seek that medical care, so for instance, they're going to go to Johns Hopkins ER or to our workers' compensation clinic, then they're going to take that document with them. And once per week, our administrators are looking at these documents, and they're trying to tackle various problems, including injuries on our unit. And what they're going to do is make procedural changes based off of the injuries that they're seeing. So to give you an idea of some of the changes that might be made based off of these weekly meetings, we might make, instead of saying this equipment is readily available, we highly suggest that you use it, we may make it mandatory. And so for instance, now if we know a patient tends to headbutt or they tend to bite, we might say, you have to wear a helmet when you're working with this patient, or you must wear arm guards. And if you're not, and you're with that patient, then disciplinary action would follow. Additionally, we may enact specific safety protocols. So an example of what a safety protocol may look like would involve announcing a particularly aggressive or dangerous patient as they enter an area where there's a large group of individuals. And this is really great because it then gives everyone else in the room, remember we've got one staff member with each patient, we have 16 patients, it's a lot of individuals. So now the staff who aren't working with that dangerous patient knows that that patient's in the room, and then they can protect themselves as well as the patient that they're working with. We also might make changes in our staffing ratio. So everyone's going to start out with 1-to-1 no matter what. However, we may know that this patient is particularly problematic either during all waking hours, which may necessitate that that patient needs to have 2-to-1 staff, or maybe we know that in certain situations that it's just more dangerous. So for instance, if we know that that patient's really difficult to manage during a meal, or perhaps they're very difficult in the bathroom, which can be really scary because there's a lot of hard surfaces, then during those times we'll assign extra staff to work with that patient. And so the injury analysis that we did was conducted using those injury reports. And those were just the internal hospital documents that we've been using for years. And the kinds of information that were on those forms included the time and date of the injury, the staff member and the patient who was involved, details about the injury, so what was happening when the injury happened, and then what were the medical outcomes? Did they need to seek medical attention? And if so, were there work restrictions following that? And so what we did is we had somebody making copies of these forms, and they gave it to me. And what I did is I took that information and put it into our database. And yes, this is the same database that Linda mentioned before. And what was really great about this is now, by putting these injuries in, we can tie all this injury data back to all that staff data that we're already collecting, as well as our recruitment data and our patient data. So this is how we're trying to come together and determine the predictors of injury. What I'm going to do now is show you some of our preliminary findings. So this is a graph depicting the total documented injuries during the years 2008 to 2010. So on average, approximately 350 injuries are being documented each year by our staff. What's interesting about these numbers is that they're pretty stable, and we have a lot of turnover and changes in the fluctuation in patients. So it's pretty interesting that it's about 350 each year. And despite all of our efforts that we have in place to try to keep people safe, injuries are still occurring at a very staggering rate. So to put this into perspective, if we have 120 staff, as Lynn mentioned, this would mean that about for every staff member each year that they work, they're likely to have 3 injuries documented per year. This is a graph depicting the total number of workers' compensation claims that are filed every year by staff. So on average, we have about 100 workers' compensation claims made every year. So this would equate to each staff member having 1 injury per year that necessitated medical attention. And if you think about the previous graph I just showed you, so that would be 1 out of every 3 injuries are going to be severe enough that you need to seek medical attention. And when you compare our numbers on our unit to the healthcare incidence rates it becomes very clear and alarming what a high-risk setting we are. Remember, the incidence rates that I showed you before was 9.3 per 100 full-time workers. We're now looking at 100 injuries per 120 workers. So it's very clear to us that we need to have a better understanding about under what circumstances our staff are being injured so that we can be a little more systematic in how we intervene. So even though I've shown you some data that we have a lot of documented injuries, we were kind of suspicious that perhaps our staff aren't documenting every injury and that there's likely a lot of underreporting taking place. Perhaps there's too much response effort in completing a form, or there's not enough time, or maybe you're going to kind of be seen as being a wuss because you got scratched, so it's not really necessary. You're only going to wait and document those really serious injuries because you need to go to the comp clinic to seek care. So just to get a better idea and to see whether or not this really actually was taking place, we created a severity index. And within the severity index, we based this off of previous literature, but we modified it specific to our unit with the help of our nursing staff. And we just did a 4-point Likert type scale with a range of 1 to 4. Our number 1 mild injuries were reported if the individual did not need to seek medical attention, there was no clear visible result from the injury. So for example, if staff were kicked and there maybe were a small bruise, but no scratches. 2 would have been considered moderate, so likely that you needed first aid on site, but again, it was still pretty minor, so these would have been small abrasions like scratches. Number 3 was a more significant injury, so these were larger lacerations and typically included injuries such as bites. And number 4 were our most serious injuries. So those included times that staff had to go and seek medical care for the injuries that took place, but it also included the very high intense behaviors even if staff didn't seek medical attention, just because we wanted to be sure that we looked at those too. So that would consider something like a blow to a head, being head-butted in the head or kicked in the head. So we were actually surprised that our staff do a pretty good job about reporting all different types of injuries. So now I want to show you some more specific data about how our staff are being injured. So this information is going to help us pinpoint exactly where we need to start tackling this problem and focusing our efforts. And this graph depicts the most frequently types of documented injuries on our unit. And these data are aggregated across all the years, 2008 to 2010. So for us, the number 1 documented injury were bites, with 288 of those being reported over this time frame. Scratches were the second most with 219, and then muscle strains were the third ranked with 154 documented injuries. Okay, now this graph depicts under what circumstances staff are likely to be injured. And again, this information is going to help us find highest risk situations with our staff and then target those. For us, bursts were the highest ranking situation. Now let me explain, because that makes sense to me, but it may not to you. So a burst can occur in any situation, but what makes it different from all others is that the patient is engaging in very high intensity and frequent behaviors that's going to necessitate assistance. So for example, you're going to be working one-on-one with that patient, they're going to become unmanageable with you just on your own, and our staff yell backup. So at that point, we have multiple staff that are available that run to assist given this emergency situation. So that was the number 1, 127 of those incidents. The second most frequently type of situation that staff are going to be injured is during transitions. So this makes sense when you're looking at the previous graph that muscle strains are a big problem. What this graph also shows is that our staff are really dedicated and they're very kind because they're putting their own safety in jeopardy by blocking self-interest behavior that patients are doing and dangerous behavior. So the third most frequent was the blocking of that behavior with 119. So these kinds of injuries included maybe a patient was going to hit their head on a hard surface, a table or a wall, and that patient or the staff member put their hand there to brace the fall and hit their hand instead of the patient hitting their head. Or it might be that the patient goes to bite themselves and that staff member puts their limb in between and they're the ones that get bit instead. So when we're looking at this data, this really tells us that particularly with the bursts, this is something we're going to need to target. And likely it's going to have to do with a lot of communication. So in a burst, we've got 4 or 5 individuals, so a lot of hands, a small place. So they might need to be a little bit better about communicating with one another to ensure safety. We also know that they may need more training on considering the situation uncontrollable and dangerous. So our staff might be so dedicated they think we need really good data, so they want to stay in and block and manage the patient, when really we'd rather them de-escalate the situation and escort that patient to a safe room because their safety is more of a priority. So I think these are definitely places that we can improve upon. And although we haven't yet completed our injury analysis, what we do hope is that conducting this thorough analysis is going to help us better understand why our staff are being hurt so often. And hopefully this will help us target specific patient, staff, and environmental variables that need to be addressed. So some other things that we're really hoping that can be an implication to us is that with our patients and determining who we can admit at what point in time. So ideally, we would like to take a look at a patient profile on paper and see that if a patient is diagnosed with autism, for example, they tend to engage in aggressive behaviors, and we know that their behaviors are maintained by social reinforcers like attention or escape, and that they are a certain size and age, that we might know what we need to do at the front end to ensure safety, rather than bringing them onto our unit and then scrambling to make changes as they cause injuries. And if we ended up taking 16 6'2" patients who all were aggressive and headbutted, we'd be out of business very quickly. So I think it's also very important, as we're starting to find, that it's more crucial now than ever to really get our safety process more in line. What we're starting to notice is that our patients are becoming more and more challenging. And we think this has a lot to do with individuals are having increased accessibility to community-based services, which is absolutely excellent. So the more mild forms of problem behavior are being treated in the community. So what we're now seeing on our unit are kids that are really intense and very challenging. So this is only going to continue to make the risks for our staff greater. So safety is definitely not something we want to skimp on or guess, because we are very concerned about our staff. And the current methods that I've described to you today can be very effective at times, and I think they're certainly better than not doing anything. I can only imagine what our numbers would look like if we didn't already do these things. But we realize it's taken us a really long time to get to this point. And a lot of what we've learned has just been through trial and error. So we're really excited to start this behavioral safety process so that we can be more proactive and preventative and ensure that our staff are safer. What we're also realizing is that this is a really great thing to show insurance companies. So for instance, a lot of our senior behavior analysts now are asking for some of the data because the insurance companies don't want to pay such high premiums and costs for that patient to be in such an intense setting. However, if we're showing that these patients are continuing to hurt our staff, that discharging them into the community would be very dangerous to themselves, their family, and to school personnel. So to keep in the theme of our talk, I wanted to go over some of our lessons learned. I'm going to take the first one from Lynn, and Ziggy mentioned it too. You've got to collect data. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but for us it's been really, really helpful, and a lot of what we're learning about our injuries is because we're starting to look at this more systematically. And I know as we continue to do this over time, we're only going to learn more information. It's also really important to be mindful about how your environment's set up if you're working with this type of population. So what we've learned is you need a lot of specialized everything: chairs, padded walls, soft floors, plexiglass windows. The list just goes on. And of course, none of these materials come very cheap. So it's really important to get it right the first time. And we're starting to get a better idea of what works and what doesn't work. And we're really happy to be able to share that information with individuals. And what we're also finding out is that there's really no appropriate safety equipment available to the healthcare sector. So you look at other jobs that are very dangerous that I described at the beginning of my talk, such as mining and police and construction, and they have specific safety materials available to ensure that their staff are safe. However, we have higher incidence rates, but we're continuing to borrow from sports to keep our staff safe. So it'd be really great if that kind of equipment was manufactured. And we have also learned that unfortunately in our setting, training is just not enough, or perhaps we don't do it enough. That there are going to be other things that need to be put in place to ensure that staff are engaging in safer behaviors. Maybe a lottery will help. What we've presented to you today are just some examples of how we've been able to pinpoint and tackle a lot of different staffing problems, and we've been able to do that over a long period of time. And we've definitely struggled, but as Lynn mentioned, we have a really good group of people, and I'd be a bad student to say that I know our successes have a direct result of the fact that we're doing institutionalization. So our administrators are involved in the design and implementation and maintenance of our interventions, but it's not just our administrators. It's our supervisory staff who are right there on board with us. They're participating in all of our meetings, as well as our direct care staff. And we feel really fortunate to have the resources and the buy-in from our administration. They appreciate behavioral principles, and we have a small, tight-knit community to be able to do this. So I want to thank you very much. This is Lynn and I's first time being here, and we're really happy to have presented our data with us, and feel free to visit us if you're ever in Baltimore.